Jonathan Reed was a man people admired from a distance. To the world, he was the definition of success, a brilliant CEO who had built his company from the ground up, a leader whose sharp mind and calm confidence could turn problems into opportunities. But in the quiet hours of his life, away from the shining city offices and glowing magazine articles, Jonathan was not a man of triumph. He was simply a father, and a very broken one. For months, he had lived in a place that felt more like a shadow than reality, the long white halls of the hospital. He had traded polished boardrooms for waiting rooms, designer suits for the same grey jacket he wore every day, and business lunches for cold cups of coffee that never seemed to taste right. He was not here to make deals anymore. He was here for his son. Matthew Reed was only 10 years old. He had bright, curious eyes that always wanted to know how the world worked, and a laugh that filled every room like music. He loved puzzles, football games, and had a habit of asking questions that even Jonathan, the man who had an answer for everything, could not always explain. But now, those eyes were closed, and that laugh had been silent for too long. It had been 3 months since the accident. A normal day, an ordinary car ride home, and in one unpredictable moment, Jonathan's world changed. Matthew had survived, but not in the way any father would hope for. His little body had grown still, lying on a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and blinked, keeping track of every fragile breath. Doctors called it a coma. Jonathan called it the hardest word he had ever had to live with. Every day began the same. Jonathan would walk down the corridor of the children's wing, nodding politely to nurses and staff who now knew him by name. His shoes made soft sounds against the floor, but in his heart, there was only heaviness. He would push open the door to his son's room, take a deep breath, and step inside. The room was always the same: clean, quiet, too quiet. The curtains were often half drawn, letting in a soft light that touched Matthew's face. His son's hair had grown longer than he liked, and Jonathan found himself smoothing it back gently each time he came. He would sit in the chair by the bed, sometimes for hours, sometimes for the entire night, watching for a sign, waiting for a miracle that seemed too far away. He tried to talk to Matthew, because the doctors encouraged it. "Speak to him as if he can hear you," they said. And so Jonathan did. At first, it felt strange, speaking to someone who never replied. But as the days stretched on, he found it gave him comfort. He would tell Matthew about the office, about the books he had been reading, about the weather outside. Sometimes he even told old stories like the one about Matthew's first football match, when he had run the wrong way and scored a goal for the other team, laughing the entire time. Jonathan would smile at the memory, but then the silence would fall again, pressing against him like a weight. The doctors came and went, always with the same look on their faces. They spoke carefully, choosing words that carried no promises. "We are monitoring his condition. There has been little change. These cases are unpredictable." Jonathan listened, nodded politely, and returned to his chair. But inside, he wanted to shout, to demand something more. How could there be no plan, no clear answer? He was a man who lived by strategies and solutions, yet here he was, completely helpless. At night, when the hospital grew quieter and the lights dimmed, Jonathan's thoughts became the loudest. He thought about his late wife, Anna, who had been the light of both his and Matthew's lives. She had passed away years before, leaving Jonathan to raise their son alone. He had promised her he would take care of Matthew, that he would always protect him. But as he sat in that hospital room, staring at his boy who did not move, he felt like he had failed in the only promise that truly mattered. Sometimes he would close his eyes and try to imagine life as it was before the mornings when Matthew would burst into his room, asking if pancakes were ready, or the evenings when they would sit on the couch and watch cartoons together. He remembered the sound of Matthew's voice calling out, "Dad," with such joy. Those memories gave him strength, but they also cut deeply, because he could not be sure if he would ever hear them again. The staff at the hospital admired Jonathan's dedication. Many fathers visited, but few stayed as he did, almost living within those walls. Nurses often whispered about how strong he was, how devoted. But Jonathan did not feel strong. Each day was a battle between hope and despair, between believing his son would return to him and fearing that he never would. There were moments when he almost gave up. Times when the weight of hopelessness pressed too hard, and he thought about stepping away, about trying to find peace elsewhere. But every time he looked at Matthew's still face, he knew he could never leave. He was his father. This was his place. The nights were the hardest. Alone with the sound of machines and the steady rhythm of Matthew's breathing, Jonathan felt his heart breaking over and over again. He prayed something he had not done in years. He prayed for strength, for answers, for anything that could bring his boy back. He prayed even when he was not sure anyone was listening. And yet, even in his darkest hours, there was always a flicker of something deep inside him. Call it love, call it hope, call it a father's unshakable bond. It kept him from collapsing entirely. He could not give up, not while Matthew was still here, still fighting in his own silent way. But as the weeks turned into months, Jonathan could not deny the truth: he was exhausted. He had left most of his business in the hands of his team, barely checking in anymore. His friends had stopped calling, unsure of what to say. His world had narrowed down to this room, this bed, this waiting. And then, one evening, when the weight of silence seemed heavier than ever, something unusual happened. Jonathan had just settled into the chair, preparing for another long night beside his son, when a soft knock came at the door. It opened quietly, and in stepped a young nurse he had not noticed before. She was not one of the regulars on Matthew's rotation, but there was something warm and steady in her eyes. She smiled gently, as though she already knew the pain he carried. Jonathan nodded politely, expecting her to check the machines and leave like the others. But instead, she lingered, pulling the chair closer to Matthew's bedside. And though Jonathan did not yet realize it, this small moment was the beginning of a change, something unexpected, something that would carry both father and son into a story neither of them could have imagined. Jonathan had grown used to faces coming and going in the hospital. Doctors changed shifts, nurses rotated from one ward to another, and interns often stopped by to observe. Most of them were kind and professional, but their interactions rarely went beyond routine. They checked Matthew's machines, scribbled notes, and left with polite smiles. None of them lingered, none of them stayed. For Jonathan, it had become a rhythm he no longer paid attention to until the evening Emily Carter walked in. Emily was not what Jonathan expected. She was younger than most of the staff he usually saw, with a quiet presence that did not demand attention yet could not be ignored. Her uniform was the same as the others, but her eyes carried something different, an unspoken warmth, a kind of faith that felt out of place in the sterile, cautious environment of the hospital. She moved with calm confidence, as though she believed she belonged exactly where she was. At first, Jonathan assumed she was just another temporary nurse assigned to his son's room. He watched her gently adjust the monitors, her hands steady and careful. But instead of leaving after completing her duties, Emily pulled the chair closer to Matthew's bed. She sat down, as if she had no intention of rushing. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. He had seen hundreds of nurses in the past 3 months, but none had taken this kind of time. His instinct was to question her, but something about her calm presence made him remain silent. Emily leaned forward slightly, looking at Matthew's face. "Hi there, Matthew," she said softly, her voice warm and gentle. "It's Emily. I'll be spending some time with you." Jonathan's chest tightened. For months, he had been the one to talk, hoping against silence, but hearing someone else address his son so personally stirred something inside him. He shifted in his chair, unsure whether to encourage or dismiss her. "You talked to him?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice raspy from long nights without sleep. Emily glanced at him and gave a small smile. "Of course. Just because he isn't answering doesn't mean he can't hear." Jonathan wanted to believe that. The doctors had said similar things, but always with an undertone of uncertainty. Emily, however, spoke as though it were a fact, as though she knew. "You think he listens?" Jonathan pressed, his tone carrying both hope and skepticism. Emily's smile didn't fade. "Children are stronger than we think. Sometimes, even when they seem far away, they're still holding on to every word. Talking gives them a reason to come back." Jonathan studied her face, looking for the doubt that usually appeared when people spoke of recovery. But Emily's eyes held none. She looked at Matthew as though she could already see the boy awake, laughing, running through the halls again. The silence stretched for a moment. Then, almost like a whisper meant only for him, Emily said, "I can wake your son." The words struck Jonathan like a wave. For months, he had lived in a sea of cautious phrases and scientific terms. No one had ever spoken with such certainty. He leaned back in his chair, searching her expression for exaggeration, but found none. "You think, you can do that?" he asked slowly, afraid of the answer. Emily nodded gently. "Not by magic. Not instantly. But I believe he's still here, and with the right care, the right connection, he can find his way back." Jonathan shook his head slightly, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. "You don't know how many times I've heard promises dressed as possibilities. Every doctor comes in with their charts and numbers. I've stopped letting myself believe." Emily did not argue. She simply placed her hand gently over Matthew's small one and said, "Then let me believe for both of you." Something about her tone disarmed him. It wasn't the confidence of someone boasting, nor the false reassurance people gave when they didn't know what else to say. It was quiet, steady, and real. That night, Jonathan watched Emily interact with Matthew in ways he had never seen before. She told him little stories, like how she had once been afraid of thunderstorms but now found comfort in them because they reminded her of nature's strength. She read a few pages from a children's adventure book she carried in her bag, her voice rising and falling with the characters. She hummed a tune while checking the monitors, not a formal lullaby but a soft melody that filled the room with warmth. Jonathan, who had spent so many nights drowning in silence, found himself strangely at peace just listening. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt less like a waiting room of despair and more like a bedroom where a child might actually sleep peacefully. When Emily finally rose to leave, she turned to Jonathan. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said with quiet assurance. "Don't give up on him tonight." Jonathan nodded slowly, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. The following day, true to her word, Emily returned. And then the next, and the next. She seemed to appear not just as a nurse but as a companion in the fight Jonathan had been carrying alone. Sometimes she would ask Jonathan to join her in speaking to Matthew. "Tell him about your day," she encouraged. "Even if it feels silly. He needs your voice." At first Jonathan struggled, his words heavy with hesitation, but Emily's gentle reminders helped him open up. He began telling Matthew about small things, the book he had tried to read but couldn't finish, the way the city lights looked from the hospital window, even about the coffee that was always too bitter. Slowly, the conversations grew easier. One evening, Emily brought a small speaker and asked Jonathan what Matthew liked to listen to. His mind immediately went to Anna, his late wife, and the lullabies she used to hum. He mentioned it softly, his voice breaking, and Emily nodded with understanding. The next day, she returned with soft recordings of those same songs, playing them gently by Matthew's bedside. Jonathan could hardly bear the sound. It was like a ghost had walked into the room, but he also saw how peaceful his son seemed under its melody. As days passed, Jonathan noticed something about Emily's presence. She never treated Matthew like a patient defined by machines. She treated him like a boy, a child still very much alive, waiting to return. She asked Jonathan what games Matthew liked, what his favorite food was, what made him laugh. She painted a picture of his life, reminding Jonathan of details he had buried under the weight of sorrow. It was not just Matthew who was changing under Emily's care. Jonathan was too. For months, he had been trapped in silence, his heart locked in grief and exhaustion. But with Emily beside them, a new rhythm entered his days, one filled with gentle conversation, quiet faith, and the smallest spark of something he thought he had lost completely, hope. Still, part of him resisted. He could not allow himself to believe fully, not yet. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break him if it failed. And yet, every time Emily looked at Matthew and said softly, "He's listening," Jonathan wanted more than anything for her to be right. One late evening, after another long day, Jonathan found himself speaking to Emily in the hallway. The hospital was quiet, the hum of machines faint behind the closed doors. He hesitated before asking the question that had burned inside him since that first night. "Why do you care so much?" His voice was tired, but curious. Emily paused, her expression thoughtful. "Because every child deserves someone who refuses to give up on them," she said. Then she added, with a small, almost secret smile, "and sometimes, believing is the best medicine of all." Jonathan stood in silence, her words echoing in his heart. For the first time in months, he realized he was not alone in this fight. And though he still could not predict the outcome, he felt the weight of his burden shift just enough to make room for something he had almost forgotten: faith in the impossible. Jonathan had always been a man of logic. His entire career was built on numbers, strategies, and carefully planned moves. But in the hospital room, logic seemed to fail him every day. Every chart, every statistic, every clinical explanation only reminded him of what he might lose. Emily, however, was different. She didn't talk about percentages or medical terms. She spoke about hope, belief, and connection, things that felt far less certain, but somehow far more powerful. It began with small changes in their routine. Jonathan had grown used to silence hours of sitting by his son's side, whispering occasional words and then lapsing back into quiet despair. Emily refused to let the room stay still. Each day, she came with new ideas, little ways to stir life into the air around Matthew. One afternoon, she brought a colorful storybook. "This was one of my favorites when I was little," she said as she settled into the chair. She began to read aloud, her voice carrying warmth and energy into the room. At first, Jonathan simply listened, unsure if it made any difference. But as Emily's voice painted images of castles and adventures, Jonathan thought he saw Matthew's fingers twitch slightly. His breath caught, and he leaned forward, but convinced himself it was just his imagination. Emily noticed too, but instead of rushing to conclusions, she smiled knowingly. "See? He's listening," she whispered. Jonathan wanted to argue, to remind her of how the doctors dismissed such movements as involuntary. But he couldn't shake the image of that tiny twitch. For the first time, doubt didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a doorway to hope. The next day, Emily encouraged Jonathan to take part. "You know his favorite stories better than I do," she said gently. Jonathan hesitated. "I'm not. I don't know if I can do it the way you do." "You don't need to," Emily reassured him. "He just needs to hear you. Your voice is home to him." That night, Jonathan cleared his throat and picked up one of Matthew's books, the one they used to read together before bed. His voice cracked at first, uncertain, but as he read page after page, he remembered the nights Matthew would giggle at the funny parts or lean against him sleepily. His chest tightened, but he kept reading. And though Matthew's eyes stayed closed, Jonathan thought he saw his son's lips quiver ever so slightly, as if trying to smile. Another day, Emily introduced music into the room. She had brought recordings of lullabies Jonathan had mentioned, the ones Anna used to sing. At first, Jonathan could barely stand to hear them, it hurt too much, like opening an old wound. But as the soft melodies filled the room, something shifted. The machines still beeped steadily, but the atmosphere seemed lighter, warmer. Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering the way Anna used to hum those tunes while rocking Matthew to sleep. For a brief moment, he felt as though she were still with them, guiding them through this darkness. Emily noticed his struggle and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's okay to let yourself feel it," she said softly. "He needs to feel it too." Jonathan nodded, tears burning his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. For once, he allowed himself to cry openly, knowing that Matthew, wherever his mind was, needed to hear not only strength but also love. Days passed, and the routine grew deeper. Emily began encouraging Jonathan to share more personal stories with Matthew, not just simple updates. "Tell him about the times you laughed together," she said. "Remind him of the life he has waiting." So Jonathan did. He told Matthew about their trip to the beach last summer, how Matthew had tried to build the biggest sandcastle but ended up laughing when the tide washed it away. He spoke of the camping trip where Matthew had insisted on staying up all night to see the stars but fell asleep halfway through. He even told the silly story of how Matthew once tried to cook breakfast as a surprise, burning the toast so badly the smoke alarm went off. Emily listened quietly as Jonathan spoke, occasionally glancing at Matthew's face. "Do you see that?" she asked once. His eyelids moved. Jonathan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "You really think so?" Emily nodded firmly. "I don't just think so. I know." The doctors, of course, remained cautious. When Jonathan reported what he had seen, they explained it as reflexes, insisting there was no solid evidence of consciousness. But Emily didn't waver. "Science measures what it can see," she told Jonathan one evening. "But sometimes, the most important things are the ones it can't." Jonathan wanted to believe her. And though doubt still whispered in his mind, he could no longer ignore the small changes he had witnessed himself. Each twitch, each flutter of an eyelid, felt like a tiny spark in the darkness. One evening, Emily suggested something unusual. "Why don't you play his favorite game with him?" she asked. Jonathan frowned. "How can I? He can't move." "You don't need him to move," Emily replied. "Just play as if he's watching. Describe it to him. Make him feel part of it." So Jonathan tried. He brought in a small football, rolling it gently on the floor as he described the moves, just as he used to when they practiced together at home. He explained every pass, every imaginary goal, laughing softly at how Matthew would probably shout if he got the score wrong. As silly as it felt at first, the act stirred something inside him. For the first time in months, he was not just waiting, he was living moments with his son again, even if Matthew couldn't respond. Emily encouraged more of these exercises. "The more life you bring into this room," she said, "the more he'll feel it pulling him back." And indeed, the room no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt alive, filled with stories, laughter, music, and even the faint sound of Jonathan's chuckles, which had been absent for too long. One night, after reading another story and humming along with the lullaby, Jonathan noticed something that stopped him cold. Matthew's fingers, which usually rested motionless against the blanket, moved ever so slightly once, then again. Not the random twitch he had seen before, but a slow, deliberate movement, as though trying to hold on to something. Jonathan's breath caught. He leaned closer, his voice trembling. "Matthew? It's Dad. Can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was no response. But then, faintly, his son's hand pressed weakly against his own. Jonathan gasped, his heart racing, tears welling in his eyes. "Emily," he called, his voice breaking. Emily hurried over, her eyes widening as she saw it too. But instead of rushing in panic, she smiled. "I told you," she whispered. "He's finding his way back." Jonathan held his son's hand tightly, his entire being trembling with emotion. It wasn't a miracle in full, not yet, but it was more than he had dared to hope for in months. And in that moment, he knew Emily's faith had carried them to this point. From that day onward, Jonathan no longer sat in silence. He poured his heart into every word, every story, every song. And though the journey ahead was still uncertain, he no longer felt alone, no longer felt powerless. For the first time since the accident, he believed not just in medicine, not just in time, but in love, persistence, and the quiet determination of a young nurse who refused to give up. The days that followed the first sign of Matthew's movement felt different. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Jonathan, who once sat in silence with heavy shoulders, now leaned forward with an eagerness he had not felt in months. Each time Matthew's fingers twitched, each time his eyelids fluttered, Jonathan's heart leapt. They were small signs, but to a father's eyes, they were everything. Emily remained calm, her presence steady as always. "These are good changes," she said with a gentle smile. "It means he's responding, even if only little by little." Jonathan nodded, though his heart wanted to jump ahead, to believe the miracle was already here. But he reminded himself to be patient. He had learned over these long months that hope was fragile, and it had to be protected carefully. Still, there was something undeniable happening. When Jonathan spoke, Matthew's breathing sometimes changed, becoming slightly deeper or slower. When Emily read stories, Matthew's eyelids flickered more often. And once, when the lullabies played softly, Jonathan swore he heard the faintest sound of his son's lips trying to form a word. Jonathan could hardly sleep at night. Even when exhaustion weighed on him, he refused to leave Matthew's side. Every moment felt precious, every second carried the possibility that something might happen. He lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the miracle he had dreamed of for months. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was early, just before dawn. The hospital hallways were quiet, the usual noise of footsteps and voices replaced by the hum of machines and the occasional distant sound of a cart being rolled. Jonathan sat in his usual chair, his head heavy with sleeplessness. His hand rested gently over Matthew's, as it always did, a silent promise that he would never leave. Emily had stayed later than usual that night. She had read to Matthew, hummed songs, and even encouraged Jonathan to share one more story before resting his eyes. Jonathan had told the tale of Matthew's first school play, where he had forgotten his lines but stood proudly on stage anyway, waving at his dad in the audience. Emily had smiled at the memory, and Jonathan had laughed softly, his heart aching with longing. Now, in the stillness of the early morning, the room was quiet. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle light across Matthew's bed. Jonathan rubbed his tired eyes, wondering if he should close them for just a moment. And then, it happened. At first, it was so small that Jonathan thought he had imagined it. A faint movement of Matthew's lips. He blinked, leaning closer. Then, clearer this time, a soft sound escaped, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Dad!" Jonathan froze, his heart slamming in his chest. He stared at his son, disbelief and hope colliding inside him. "Matthew," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Say it again. Please." Matthew's eyelids fluttered, and slowly, painfully, they began to open. His eyes, though weak and heavy, were filled with life Jonathan had feared he might never see again. And then, with effort, his son's voice came again, fragile but real. "Dad!" Jonathan gasped, tears spilling down his face as he clutched Matthew's hand. "Oh God, oh my boy, you're back," he cried, unable to stop the sobs that shook his body. He pressed his forehead against his son's hand, overwhelmed with relief and joy. Emily, who had been dozing lightly in the corner, jolted awake at the sound. When she saw Matthew's open eyes, her own filled with tears. She moved quickly to check the monitors, but her hands trembled with joy rather than fear. "You did it, Matthew," she whispered softly, leaning close. "You came back." Doctors rushed in soon after, alerted by the sudden changes in the monitors. They were astonished to see Matthew awake, his voice faint but steady as he whispered to his father. They checked his vitals, shining lights in his eyes, asking him simple questions. Though his voice was weak and his movements slow, Matthew responded. Every word was like music to Jonathan's ears. The doctors called it a rare recovery, something that science could not fully explain. They used careful terms like spontaneous awakening and unusual progress, but Jonathan barely heard them. To him, there was nothing rare about it, it was a miracle. A miracle born of love, faith, and the tireless care of a young nurse who refused to give up. For hours, Jonathan could not let go of his son's hand. He kept repeating words of love, telling Matthew how proud he was, how strong he had been, how much he had been missed. Matthew's weak smile was all the response he needed. Later that day, as the excitement settled, Jonathan found himself sitting by the bed, still holding his son's hand, while Emily stood nearby. He turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "You said you could wake him," he whispered. "And you were right." Emily shook her head gently. "No, Jonathan. It wasn't me. It was him. And it was you. He came back because he knew he was loved, every single day." Jonathan looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "But without you, I don't know if I could have held on long enough." Emily smiled softly. "Sometimes all it takes is someone to remind us not to stop believing." As the sun rose higher in the sky, filling the room with golden light, Jonathan realized how much had changed in just a few hours. The fear that had lived inside him for months was beginning to fade, replaced by a hope that felt stronger than ever. His son was awake. His son had spoken. And though the road ahead would not be easy, he no longer faced it alone. That night, after the doctors left and the room grew quiet again, Jonathan sat beside Matthew, stroking his hair gently. "You're so strong, buddy," he whispered. "I knew you'd find your way back." Matthew's eyes fluttered open briefly, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "Dad," he murmured again, before slipping into a peaceful sleep. Jonathan stayed awake, watching his son breathe, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like the beginning of something new. And in his heart, he knew this moment the miracle of hearing his son's voice again would stay with him forever. The days following Matthew's awakening felt like stepping into sunlight after a long season of storms. For months, Jonathan had lived in the shadows of fear and silence, but now, every morning began with the sound of his son's voice. It was weak at first, sometimes barely a whisper, but it was real, alive, and more precious than anything Jonathan had ever known. Doctors monitored Matthew constantly, amazed at his progress. They spoke in careful tones, explaining that recovery would take time, that Matthew's body needed to regain its strength after months of stillness. But Jonathan barely noticed their warnings. To him, every small improvement was a victory. The first time Matthew squeezed his hand intentionally, Jonathan wept. The first time he whispered hungry, Jonathan laughed through his tears, rushing to tell the nurses. And when Matthew finally smiled, a small, tired, but undeniable smile, it was as if the entire world had shifted. Emily was there through it all. Though her shifts were busy, she always found her way to Matthew's room, checking on him, offering encouragement, and reminding Jonathan to take care of himself too. She treated Matthew not like a fragile patient but like a boy with a future waiting for him. She celebrated each milestone as though she were part of the family, and in many ways, she had become just that. One afternoon, as Jonathan watched Matthew attempt to sit up with the help of a therapist, he turned to Emily, his eyes full of gratitude. "I don't think I can ever repay you for this," he said quietly. Emily shook her head with a smile. "You don't need to repay me, Jonathan. This is why I became a nurse. To see moments like this." But Jonathan knew it was more than just her profession. Emily had given something no doctor, no machine, no medicine had been able to offer: unwavering belief. And that belief had carried both father and son through their darkest days. As the weeks passed, Matthew grew stronger. His voice returned little by little, and his laughter, oh, that beautiful sound Jonathan had missed so much, began to fill the room again. Therapists worked with him daily, helping him walk again, guiding him through gentle exercises. Each step was slow, but Jonathan was there for all of them, cheering louder than he ever had at any boardroom victory. The hospital staff marveled at Jonathan's transformation. He was no longer the quiet, weary man who sat silently in despair. He smiled now, he spoke freely, and he carried a lightness in his voice that had been missing for so long. Some even whispered that the once untouchable CEO had softened, that fatherhood had reshaped him more deeply than success ever had. Jonathan didn't care what anyone said. All that mattered was Matthew. One evening, after a long day of therapy, Jonathan sat by his son's bed. Matthew was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. Emily entered quietly, carrying a small notebook. "What's that?" Jonathan asked curiously. Emily smiled, placing it on the table. "I've been writing down all the progress he's made. Every movement, every word, every milestone. I thought you might want a record not just for the doctors, but for him. So one day, when he's older, he'll know how strong he was." Jonathan picked up the notebook, his eyes misting as he flipped through the pages. Each note, written in Emily's careful handwriting, told the story of a journey back to life. He swallowed hard, overcome by emotion. This means more than you know." Emily's expression softened. "I just wanted you both to remember that even in the hardest times, there was always progress, always hope." Jonathan looked at her, realizing once again how extraordinary she was. She hadn't just cared for his son, she had cared for both of them. As Matthew's condition improved, discussions began about his discharge. The day finally came when doctors declared he was strong enough to return home. Jonathan prepared the house with excitement, making sure Matthew's favorite books were on his bedside table, his favorite posters hung back on the wall, and even the small football they used to play with sat waiting in the living room. Bringing Matthew home was like bringing light back into the house. The walls, once silent, now echoed with laughter and conversation. Neighbors and friends stopped by with gifts, offering congratulations and marveling at the miracle. Jonathan watched proudly as Matthew told them, in his still soft but growing voice, about the nurses and the stories and the songs that had helped him. Life, of course, did not return to normal instantly. There were follow-up appointments, physical therapy sessions, and days when Matthew grew tired easily. But Jonathan didn't mind. He had learned the value of patience, and every challenge now felt like an opportunity to celebrate progress rather than fear setbacks. More importantly, Jonathan himself had changed. The man who once lived only for deadlines and business deals now lived for moments with his son. He no longer rushed through life, he savored it. Simple things: a shared breakfast, a walk in the park, a quiet evening reading felt like treasures he would never again take for granted. One evening, weeks after coming home, Jonathan and Matthew sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Matthew leaned against his father, his head resting comfortably on his shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "did you ever think I wouldn't wake up?" Jonathan's chest tightened. He took a deep breath before answering. "There were days when it was hard, buddy. Days when I was scared. But I never stopped hoping. And then Emily reminded me to keep believing. She helped me see that you were still with me." Matthew smiled sleepily. "I like her. She tells good stories." Jonathan chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "She does, doesn't she?" Later that night, after putting Matthew to bed, Jonathan stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. His thoughts returned to Emily, her kindness, her strength, and the way she had walked into their lives when they needed her most. He realized she had not only saved his son but had also saved him from drowning in despair. The next morning, Jonathan visited the hospital to see her. She was busy as always, moving gracefully from room to room, her smile lighting up even the most difficult cases. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Jonathan," she greeted warmly. "How's Matthew?" "He's doing better every day," Jonathan replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thanks to you." Emily shook her head gently. "Thanks to him. And to you. I just helped remind you of the strength you already had." Jonathan smiled, but his eyes held emotion. "Even so, I'll never forget what you did for us. You gave me my son back. And you reminded me what really matters." Emily's expression softened, and for a moment, they stood in quiet understanding. No more words were needed. As Jonathan left that day, he felt something new inside him, not just gratitude, but a deeper sense of purpose. He realized that his success as a CEO, though important, was not the measure of his life. His true success was being a father, being present, and cherishing the miracle he had been given. And so, life moved forward. Jonathan and Matthew built new memories, filled their days with laughter and love, and carried with them the lessons they had learned through hardship. The story of their miracle became a reminder to everyone around them that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found. For Jonathan, the real miracle was not only that his son had awakened but also that he himself had been awakened to love, to faith, and to the power of never giving up. And every time he heard Matthew's laughter ring through the house, he whispered a quiet thank you not only to the heavens but also to the young nurse whose belief had changed everything.